Frank Sinatra cut off Dean Martin after one night on stage and never forgave him. January 1961. The Sands was packed, and the Rat Pack's smile hit a knife-edge tension. Frank Sinatra needed control. Dean Martin loved to drift. One tiny joke on stage could turn brotherhood into betrayal, and Vegas would watch it happen live. Where are you watching from? Because what Dean did next changed everything. Las Vegas in winter had a certain electricity, like the desert itself was holding its breath. At the Sands Hotel, the Copa Room was the brightest furnace on the Strip. Cigarette smoke curling under chandeliers, tuxedos and sequins pressed shoulder to shoulder, laughter spilling into the hallways. On paper, it was just another engagement. In reality, it was a crown ceremony, night after night. Frank Sinatra wasn't merely the headliner. He was the gravity that kept the whole Rat Pack in orbit. When Frank walked into a room, waiters straightened, managers softened their voices, and even confident men measured their jokes. Dean Martin knew those rules better than anyone. He'd been beside Frank through good years and ugly ones, and he understood the one thing Frank guarded more fiercely than his fame: respect. Not applause, respect. That week, it was brittle. Whispers about politics, old romances, and loyalty followed Frank like a shadow, and he responded the only way he knew: tightening the reins. The show had a rhythm, a script disguised as chaos, and everyone played their role, so the crowd could believe the magic was effortless. If one man broke the rhythm, the spell would snap. And in Vegas, when a spell snaps in public, it doesn't just embarrass you, it brands you. Dean's secret was that his looseness was work. People called him lazy, lucky, the guy who could stroll on stage and make a room fall in love. But Dean had learned to look unbothered the way some men learn to fight, because if you seem untouched, nobody can see what hurts you. He grew up watching pride get men chewed up, and he swore he'd never beg for approval. So he became the cool one, the half-grin, the drink, the shrug that said, nothing matters. Frank was the opposite. Frank needed every note to land and every room to feel his authority. The contrast made them a perfect pair, until it didn't. Lately Dean had noticed little changes. Frank erecting the band sharper, snapping at Joey for a late line, staring too long when the audience laughed at the wrong moment. Dean would toss a joke to soften it, and Frank would laugh, but his eyes stayed hard. Dean told himself it was just stress. Still, a resentment started to grow, quiet and unfair. Why did everything have to be Frank's way? Why did the music have to be treated like a church? That night, Dean walked toward the stage with that thought tucked behind his smile, like a match hidden in a cuff. Backstage at the Copa Room, the laughter always sounded thinner. You could hear the crowd through the curtains, a living animal waiting to be fed, and you could hear the business too. The hotel bosses who measured entertainment in profit and headlines. The Rat Pack's chemistry wasn't just friendship, it was a product. Everyone knew the rule: never let the audience see the seams. If Frank looked small, the whole brand looked small. The band had charts and cues, but the real script lived in Frank's nods and glances. Sammy carried the weight of being brilliant in a country that didn't always want him on stage, so he watched moods like weather. Joey kept things moving. Peter smoothed the rooms Frank refused to charm. And Frank was the engine. When he was calm, everybody joked freely. When he tightened up, everyone adjusted their breath. That night, Frank arrived already wound tight, jaw set, greeting people with a smile that seemed borrowed. Dean noticed and felt the old impulse rise. Loosen him up, remind him we're friends, remind him he's not a king. It sounded harmless in Dean's head. A quick tease. The kind that always got a laugh. But the line between teasing and humiliating is only obvious after you've crossed it, and the crowd has already decided. For Frank, singing wasn't a party trick. It was the one place he felt clean. Offstage, he was always managing something. Phone calls, favors, alliances, the constant fear that the world's love could turn on a dime. He'd built a tough skin in public, but it never fully covered the old wound underneath. The need to be taken seriously. People loved to call him charming, dangerous, funny. Few bothered to say what he wanted to hear, that he was great. In the dressing room, he checked his cuffs twice, then again, like control could be stitched into fabric. Sammy watched him quietly and knew the signs. Frank's jokes were sharper, his pauses longer. Dean, meanwhile, leaned into his own armor, pouring easy charm over everything. When Frank stepped into the spotlight and the first notes floated out, the room went still in that special way. 2,800 strangers, holding the same breath. Frank's shoulders loosened by a fraction. This was the territory he ruled without needing to threaten anyone. And that was exactly why it was dangerous. If you wanted to hurt Frank, you didn't have to punch him. You just had to interrupt the moment where he felt safe. Dean stood a few feet behind him, smiling at the crowd, and felt a reckless idea take shape. The night unfolded smoothly at first, almost teasing Dean with how easy it felt. Frank opened strong, the band tight behind him, the crowd eating from his hand. Sammy slid between impressions and songs. Joey's jokes landed clean. Peter worked the room like a diplomat at a cocktail party. Dean played his part perfectly. Loose shoulders, half-lidded eyes, that casual sway that made it look like he'd wandered onto the stage by accident. Inside, though, Dean felt the pressure of 3 relentless weeks. Same jokes, same beats, same hierarchy. Frank in front, always in front. When Frank announced the next song, one of his most personal numbers, the room quieted in a way Dean recognized instantly. This was Frank's sacred ground. The spotlight narrowed. The band softened. Frank closed his eyes as he sang the opening line, and something in Dean snapped, not anger exactly, more like impatience mixed with envy. He took a step closer, then another, mimicking Frank's graceful hand movements, exaggerating them just enough to register. At first, only the front tables noticed. A ripple of laughter spread. Dean felt it hit him like warmth. He pushed again, lip-syncing the words, turning reverence into parody. The laughter grew louder, faster. Dean told himself Frank would laugh too, that this was brotherhood, that he was saving the night from becoming too heavy. But even before Frank turned around, the air on stage changed. Sammy saw it before anyone else, the way Frank's shoulders stiffened mid-note, the microsecond pause that meant danger. Joey froze with a joke half-formed. Peter stopped smiling. Dean didn't. He went further, feeding off the audience's reaction, grabbing a hat, tilting it at a ridiculous angle, striking a mock-heroic pose. The room erupted. Frank turned, still singing, and for a split-second confusion crossed his face, followed by something colder. But Frank was a professional. He finished the song, without missing a note. When the applause crashed down, it wasn't clean anymore. It was mixed, admiration tangled with mockery. Frank bowed stiffly, jaw tight, then gestured toward Dean with a smile that looked polite and felt like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly, "Dean Martin." The crowd laughed again, unaware of the warning buried in the tone. Dean felt it then, the shift from fun to threat, but pride kept him upright. He tossed out a line, tried to smooth it over, calling Frank the best. Frank nodded once. "Nobody does," he replied, voice controlled. Then he turned back to the audience and announced a short break. Off stage, the applause faded, replaced by silence thick enough to choke on. Frank didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice was quiet, precise, and lethal. "You humiliated me," he said. Dean tried to laugh it off, but the words landed heavy. This wasn't about a joke anymore. It was about trust, and it was breaking fast. Backstage, the temperature dropped. Frank's calm burned hotter than anger. "You took my song," he said, and turned it into a punchline. Dean bristled, finally snapping back that Frank took himself too seriously, that this was supposed to be fun. The word fun hung there, useless. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Fun doesn't make me look small," he said. The argument sharpened, voices low but deadly, each sentence stripping away years of shared history. When Dean said they were equals, the room went still. Frank stared at him like he was seeing a stranger. "Do the second show without me," Frank said. "Let's see how equal you are." Then he walked out. Not stormed, walked. 30 minutes before showtime, Frank Sinatra left the Sands Hotel. Panic followed him like smoke. Managers scrambled, waiters whispered. The band stared at their instruments like they might explain what to do next. Dean stood frozen, the laughter from earlier replaying in his head, with a sour edge. Sammy watched him closely, reading the damage. Without Frank, there was no Rat Pack. Just four men standing under lights meant for something bigger. Dean tried to chase Frank, but Sammy stopped him, firm and serious. "Not yet," he said. "You need to understand what you did before you try to fix it." Dean nodded, but fear was already crawling up his spine. For the first time, the cool guy felt a wave of caring, and it was crushing. In a small dressing room, away from the noise, Sammy closed the door and told Dean the truth. Frank wasn't just angry. He was scared. Scared of being disrespected, of being abandoned, of losing the one place he felt untouchable. "When he sings," Sammy said quietly, "that's his armor." Dean listened, the pieces finally clicking together in a way they never had before. The joke wasn't harmless. It was a hammer. Sammy didn't soften it. Intent didn't matter. Impact did. Dean put his head in his hands, the bravado draining out of him. He asked what to do, and the answer was simple and terrifying. Apologize without defending yourself. Admit you were wrong. Dean checked the clock. Frank would be gone soon, fleeing to Palm Springs like he always did when the world felt hostile. If Dean waited, the distance would harden into something permanent. The show downstairs collapsed into chaos, but Dean barely heard it. Fame, applause, money. None of it mattered compared to the thought of losing Frank for good. Dean grabbed his coat and keys. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just left, driving hard into the desert night, rehearsing words he'd never practiced before. Not jokes, not charm, but accountability. 2 hours of road stretched ahead of him, and for once, Dean Martin wasn't pretending not to care. The highway to Palm Springs was empty and unforgiving, a ribbon of darkness cutting through the desert. Dean drove fast, not reckless, just determined, his mind replaying the moment Frank turned around on stage. That look, confusion curdling into hurt, had followed him mile after mile. For years, Dean had worn indifference like a shield, believing it made him untouchable. Now it felt flimsy. He realized how often he'd hidden behind humor to avoid admitting fear or jealousy. Frank's perfection had always intimidated him. Frank's need for control had always irritated him. And instead of saying either out loud, Dean had chosen the easy laugh. By the time Palm Springs lights appeared, Dean knew this wasn't about saving a show or a reputation. It was about saving a friendship that had quietly shaped his adult life. Frank's house was dark except for one light, glowing like a warning. Dean knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. He tried the door, unlocked. Inside, Frank sat alone in the living room, drink in hand, staring past the television that wasn't on. He didn't look up. "What are you doing here?" he asked flatly. Dean swallowed. This was the moment. No audience. No laughter. Just two men and the damage between them. Dean said the only thing that mattered. "I'm here to apologize." "For real?" Frank laughed once, humorless. "I heard your apology backstage," he said. "Didn't impress me." Dean nodded. "That wasn't one," he admitted. "That was me protecting myself." The honesty surprised them both. Frank stayed quiet, which felt worse than yelling. Dean sat across from him, hands open, resisting every instinct to soften the moment with charm. He spoke slowly, deliberately, acknowledging what he'd done without excuse. He told Frank he'd been careless, that he'd chosen attention over respect. When Frank finally spoke, his voice shook. "You made me feel small," he said. The words landed heavy. Dean didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "I know." Frank stood, pacing, anger mixing with something closer to grief. "You know what singing is to me," he said. "That's where I'm vulnerable." Dean felt the full weight of it then. He admitted something he'd barely admitted to himself, that for a moment, he'd been jealous of the applause Frank commanded so effortlessly. "I wanted it," Dean said quietly, "and I took it the wrong way." The room went still. Frank studied him, searching for a lie, and found none. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until Frank finally spoke again. "You think not caring makes you cool," he said. "It doesn't. It makes you dangerous." Dean absorbed it without flinching. He saw how often his jokes had cut people without him noticing. "I won't do that again," he said. "Not to you. Not to anyone." Frank's anger ebbed, replaced by exhaustion. He sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples. For a long moment, Dean thought he'd still lost him. Then Frank sighed. "You really drove 2 hours just to say this?" Dean nodded. "I'd have driven 20. That earned the ghost of a smile. Frank stood and pulled Dean into a hug, real unguarded. "Don't ever make my music a joke again," he said quietly. "If you do, we're done." Dean promised. Outside, the desert was silent, the night holding their secret. The damage wasn't erased, but it was acknowledged, and that was enough to start healing. They left together before dawn, two tired men choosing friendship over pride. When they arrived back in Las Vegas, as the sun rose, the sands looked strangely small. Sammy, Joey, and Peter were waiting, faces lined with worry. Relief washed over them when they saw Frank and Dean together. Frank addressed them calmly, setting a new rule with a firm voice. "We lift each other up," he said. "We never humiliate each other." Everyone nodded. The second show was gone, the money lost, but something more valuable had been salvaged. The story never reached the papers. The Rat Pack kept its code. Years passed, careers shifted, tensions flared and cooled, but that night became a quiet line none of them crossed again. When Dean died decades later, Frank couldn't bring himself to attend the funeral. Instead, he sent flowers with a note that said everything he struggled to say out loud. Their legend wasn't built on jokes or bravado. It was built on the harder choice, to stay, to apologize, to listen. In the end, that was the genius moment no audience ever saw. Two men powerful enough to walk away, choosing instead to come back together. The real confrontation didn't end in Palm Springs. It echoed the next time they stepped on stage together. The audience expected swagger, jokes, the usual Rat Pack mischief. What they didn't see was the silent agreement stitched between Frank and Dean. Midway through the set, Frank paused longer than usual before a song, glancing at Dean. It was a test, subtle and public. Dean felt it immediately. This time, he didn't lean into the laugh. He stepped back, hands loose at his sides, giving Frank the space. The band followed Frank's cue, and the room settled into that reverent hush again. Frank sang with an edge sharpened by relief, not anger. When he finished, the applause was pure. Dean clapped first, loud, unmistakable. It was a small gesture, but it flipped the power dynamic the right way. No mockery, no competition. Respect. Frank nodded once, barely visible, but it said everything. The audience sensed something had shifted, though they couldn't name it. What looked like restraint was actually trust being rebuilt in real time. Dean had learned that genius isn't always the joke that lands. Sometimes it's the joke you don't make. Backstage afterward, the atmosphere was different, lighter, steadier. Frank spoke first. "That's how we do it," he said, not accusing, just stating a standard. Dean agreed without hedging. The crew noticed too. People relaxed. Jokes returned, but with a new awareness. Dean caught himself several times, choosing silence over a wisecrack, and each time it felt like growth rather than loss. Frank, for his part, eased his grip, letting moments breathe instead of controlling them. The balance they found wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Power shifted not because someone won, but because both adjusted. That was the genius reaction, mutual restraint in a world that rewarded spectacle. The crowd only saw polish. The men felt the repair. Over the next weeks, whispers tried to start. Why did Frank skip a show? Why did Dean look subdued? But nothing stuck. The Rat Pack's unity held. When tension surfaced, Frank spoke sooner. When jealousy flickered, Dean named it to himself and let it pass. Their performances gained a new depth, an undercurrent of respect that sharpened every note and punchline. Audiences called it chemistry. The men knew it was discipline. The public confrontation had happened once, painfully. The genius move was refusing to repeat it. By choosing dignity over dominance, they protected the thing that mattered most, the bond that made the legend believable. Authority reacted quietly. Management stopped pushing for antics that risked humiliation. The crowd responded with loyalty, sensing the integrity beneath the show. Frank's confidence steadied. Dean's ease became intentional. When a joke cut too close one night, Frank caught Dean's eye and Dean backed off instantly. No words needed. The tension broke not with applause, but with trust. That's how power really flips. Not in a loud moment everyone remembers, but in the quiet ones that follow, when people choose better. Time tested what had been repaired. Weeks passed, then months, and the pressures that had cracked the bond didn't disappear. They returned in quieter forms. New crowds, new expectations, the same hunger for laughter and dominance. Frank still felt the old fear when applause wavered, the whisper that respect could vanish overnight. Dean still felt the urge to deflect seriousness with charm, to dodge discomfort by making light of it. But now, both noticed the impulse before it took control. When tension crept in, Frank spoke sooner, not loudly, just clearly. When a joke hovered on Dean's tongue that might land at someone else's expense, he let it die there. The shift was subtle, invisible to the audience, but powerful. Sammy felt it first, the relief of not bracing for fallout. Joey relaxed into timing instead of survival. Peter stopped smoothing edges that no longer cut. Authority on stage no longer came from fear or hierarchy. It came from mutual restraint. That restraint sharpened everything. Songs carried more weight. Jokes landed cleaner. The room felt steadier. People paid for spectacle, but they stayed for trust. And trust, once earned, didn't need to shout to be felt. In private, the friendship deepened in practical ways. Frank and Dean talked more, but never dramatically. A sentence between songs. A look before a cue. Frank admitted that silence scared him, that control had become a shield after too many losses. Dean admitted that pretending not to care had kept him safe, but lonely. These weren't confessions meant to cleanse the soul. They were adjustments meant to keep tomorrow intact. The friendship became something you worked at, not something you assumed would survive on reputation alone. When nights went badly, they stayed instead of leaving. When one felt exposed, the other covered without stealing the light. It wasn't perfection. They still irritated each other. They still disagreed. But the argument had changed shape. It no longer aimed to win. It aimed to protect. In an industry built on illusion, that kind of honesty felt radical. The audience never saw the labor behind it, only the ease it produced. And ease, when it's earned, reads like grace. Years later, as the rooms grew smaller and the legends heavier, that winter night remained the hinge. Other conflicts came and went, but none cut as close. In quiet moments, the memory resurfaced, not as shame, but as instruction. When age narrowed the world and grief stripped away noise, the lesson held. When Dean was gone, Frank couldn't face the public ritual of goodbye. He chose the private truth instead. Flowers, a note, words that mattered without spectacle. It was the same choice he'd learned long before. Say what's real, even if it hurts, even if no one applauds. The absence said more than any speech could. What remained wasn't a headline or a myth. It was the knowledge that repair had been chosen when walking away would have been easier. That knowledge carried weight, even in silence. That's why the story lasts. Not because of a prank or a fight, but because of what followed. Two powerful men learned that respect outlives laughter, that dignity beats dominance, and that friendship survives when pride steps aside. The legend wasn't built on swagger or control. It was built on repair, quiet, deliberate, and shared. The line that endured wasn't shouted under lights. It was lived, night after night. We're better together than apart. If this story resonated, like the video, subscribe for more human legends. And tell us, when have you chosen repair over pride? Your answer might help someone else choose better.